With the new wave of early 2000s nostalgia hitting us in the music scene right now, similar to the recent 80s and 90s waves, listeners en masse are reflecting on the styles, genres, and musical culture of this era, and it's kind of all over the place. Unlike the 80s and 90s, there is no definitive sound that people can use to define the era because all of the genres here were on completely different wavelengths. And with the rise of social media, the ability to isolate yourself in a certain musical sphere became easier than ever. This is when you had intergenerational bickering over what the best kind of mainstream pop music was for the first time. I specify intergenerational because there has always been pushback from older generations whenever the new hot song comes out, but it's never been like, listen to me kids, I'm not like the other pop artists out there, I'm the quirky one. Which seems to be the attitudes most artists, or rather the artist management, were taking during this era. This contrast was visible not only across genres, but could often be seen within the same genre, and in some cases, with the same artist. Yeah, in the mainstream, there really was no in-between when it came to music about partying and living life carefree versus literally wanting to die. Unlike nowadays, where mainstream music can lean more melancholy and even sad. The aesthetic contrast in the decade of the 2000s was blaring too, as the more upbeat music would surround itself with bright neon colors, as opposed to the dark blacks and whites we see now. But what was it about the early 2000s that had America's music scene so confused? This decade was an era of confusion and realization for pretty much everyone in this country, especially millennials. In the political landscape of the time, there were many morally ambiguous questions being asked about the government and how a free society should run. The very definition of freedom was constantly being changed. In the light of the tragic 9/11 terrorist attacks, President Bush declared that the country would be going to war against the Muslims and anyone else perceived to be terrorists. The war on terror expanded to fight against North Korea and Iran, who were lumped together as the axis of evil despite not being directly linked to the terrorist attacks. The thing to note here is that President Bush would fail to make a distinction between the country, the people, and the terrorists, lumping them all into one group called, again, the axis of evil. With much of the country united under a shared sense of trauma after 9/11, it was easy for many people to become unified under the cause of fighting for freedom, and even easier for people to be susceptible for fighting for freedom while the president states that we love freedom and they hate freedom, as the very definition of freedom in this country is being refined. Now, there were a few different reactions in the music scene to all this. Remember the Day by Stephen Curtis Chapman touches on the tragedy of 9/11 and talks about how the nation for a time was unified, and that the president was able to diffuse the tension for the general populace.
Remember the day, the courage, the valor that ran to the towers at such a great cost.
It's as direct of a reaction as you can get. There were also somber reflective songs like Have You Forgotten by Daryl Worley, who went very down to earth when talking about the fateful day.
I hear people say we don't need this war, but I say there's some things worth fighting for.
Both these songs, although very sad and emotional, have an undertone of hope, unity, and trust in their country, which sent on to influence the attitude of the more punk rock American nationalist music. Punk rock with quotations, we'll get to that. As the war on terror ramped up, there were divisions being made not only between America and the countries it was going to war with, but also a divide between America and its own citizens. Through the Patriot Act passed in 2001, the government was now able to monitor its citizens more closely without a warrant through wiretapping and other forms of surveillance in an attempt to stop domestic terrorism. The government stated that this was done to protect our freedom, but it's clear to see that in their eyes, in order to do that, some freedoms needed to be taken away, adding to the many reasons why the word freedom at the time was becoming less and less defined. The Patriot Act would target anyone suspected to be terrorists, which included a disproportionate group of minorities, fueling the internal divide in the country. But this wasn't the only divide being created. The 2000 election was no doubt a shaky one and displayed many patterns in the electoral process which are now considered normal. Although Al Gore did win the popular vote, it was the Electoral College that decided that George W. Bush would be the next in office. This was the first time there was any real debate on who truly won their spot in office, giving birth to the stark red and blue divide we see today. Now, this has existed for many years in America prior, but it was here that it would begin to craft a major part of the identity of citizens, and the attitude of red will win or blue will win would be born. And these internal divides would influence popular music in some pretty interesting ways.
You'll be sorry that you mess with the US of A. 'Cause we'll put a boot in your ass, it's the American way. Hey, Uncle Sam!
This new form of cocky, to hell with everyone else, American nationalist music takes the hope and unity from the more somber 9/11 tracks and cranks it up to the highest possible setting. Now America could be perceived as a strong, badass country ready to fight back at any moment. Lots of this music had a with us or against us sentiment, which was an attitude that became ever more present in American patriots and Republicans. But what about the mainstream? You know, the side of the industry that doesn't sing all about nationalism and war. How's that going? Oh boy, here we go. Brought over from the 90s grunge movement, the anti-establishment punk scene fit really nicely in the 2000s, juxtaposing the nationalist music. It was here as well that the punk genre branched out quite a bit. While pop punk was seen as little more than an ironic joke in the 90s, it rose to prominence in the early 2000s with lots of songs about indulging in one's youth and having dumb fun for the sake of it. On the other hand, you had the rise of nu metal and butt rock. Essentially, this was metal reshaping itself for mainstream consumption by including simpler hooks, lyrics, and structures. This included bands like Linkin Park, Papa Roach, and 3 Days Grace, among others. In this subgenre's early days, it received much criticism from the classic metal fanbase for creating what they viewed to be pop metal. However, this style of music would find a huge bit of traction and take off to create its own musical subgenre. It is in this context of a society where these two vastly different subgenres under the same umbrella can both thrive as mainstream. In a time of unprecedented confusion and moral panic, it's no surprise that the younger general populace would seek escapism, whether that be through a raw, intense, though admittedly vague, emotional release, or escapism and indulgence into youth and simple pastimes. This trend of seeking escapism would only continue for the coming decade, as the impact of the 2000 election was felt at a greater scale. The rise of EDM and pop music secured another decade of escapist music for another generation, even after the pop-punk scene started to dwindle a bit in the 2010s. This new wave of escapism would be defined by its aesthetic of bright colors, neon lights, and nightclubs. Unlike today, where everything is a bit more color graded and dark. We'll get to that next time. So we've got escapism and reactionary music, but isn't there anything that seeks to criticize the country's problems head on?
Don't wanna be an American idiot.
History repeats itself once again, as questionable terms in office lead to fantastic protest music. Like the examples used earlier, this era of protest music was very critical of the American establishment and the war. Imagery of bombs and provocative violent scenarios would often be used to depict the violence and call into question its justification. Green Day's album American Idiot, which was released in 2004, uses a lot of this kind of imagery, being very blatant about their distaste for American culture at the time. Their music video and song for Holiday takes aim at conservative America, featuring patriotism and war symbolism all over the video, while singing lyrics like "I beg to dream and differ from the hollow lies" and "Sieg Heil to the President Gasman, bombs away as your punishment." These two lines, especially the latter, are direct references to President Bush calling his dreams hollow lies. Sieg Heil is German for Hail to Victory, commonly used among Nazis to salute Hitler in World War II. Billy Joe uses it to salute Bush to paint him in the light of an authoritarian, and uses the nickname Gasman, which refers to Bush's family's place in the oil industry, and brings light to the argument that the Iraq War was an excuse to get more petroleum from the Middle East. Bands like System of a Down and My Chemical Romance also used war imagery to paint a picture of the state of the country, but in some different ways. Ghost of You, released by My Chemical Romance in 2004, follows the story of a soldier of war as he goes through the stages of grief, contemplating ending it all for love, and most tragically, realizing that they are never coming home during their final moments overseas. In the chorus, Gerard Way sings, "At the end of the world or the last thing I see, you are never coming home, never coming home. Could I, all the things that you never ever told me, all the smiles that are never ever." These lines refer to the death of a loved one and the thoughts going through a soldier's heads in their final moments as they reflect on the memories that they will never get to have. Art pieces such as these are created to get audiences to sympathize with soldiers suffering overseas that don't get thought of often by the hyper-nationalists back at home, encouraging them to die for their country. By honing in on the tragedies the individuals experience, it highlights the consequences of war and calls into question its morality as a whole. While My Chemical Romance goes for a somber emotional approach, System of a Down seeks to get your attention through provocative sounds and imagery. BYOB stands for two things here: bring your own beer like it's a party, and bring your own bombs, bringing it back to the context of war. The song asks the question, why do they always send the poor, referring to the exploitive practices the US military uses on its vulnerable lower class, as the lower class makes up the bulk of the military soldiers. It also juxtaposes itself with a pop happy sounding guitar melody and with the opening line, "Everyone's going to the party, have a real good time," directly followed up by "Dancing in the desert, blowing up the sunshine."
Everybody's going to the party, have a real good time. Dancing in the desert, blowing up the sunshine.
The deserts refer to Afghanistan and Iraq, as both places are filled with long stretches of desert, and blowing up the sunshine refers to bombings. This juxtaposition makes the violence depicted in the video and the song that much more impactful. The song not only juxtaposes itself with its lyrics, but also its sound. Multiple times the track goes from a serene, ominous instrumental to an intense hardcore mix to showcase the chaos of wartime. The 2000s were a time of chaos, confusion, and adjustment for America. As the country became more divided, so did its musical scene in ways we still see today. Whether it be nationalist music, protest music, or escapist music, all these genres lived at the same time with massive audiences, reflecting just how divided the people were. And unfortunately, since then, this hasn't changed. Music often reflects the beliefs and state of a culture, and this decade is no different. Next time we'll be touching on the 2010s as less and less escapist music would come out. What replaces it? What's the general mindset of our younger generations who grew up during these dark times? All that and more next time.